My school is a girls' school. It's a school in the maintained sector in West Sussex, and we're based in Worthing in the south coast of England. We've got about 1,300 students on roll, and we're a 7 through to 11 school.
Okay, so I know you're down in the southwest, and I know you haven't had any massive issues at the moment. But one thing you were telling me about was the change from before the summer holidays and how you were communicating with parents to what happened after those holidays.
Yeah, we learned quite a lot over the period of lockdown from March through to the summer, and we have implemented two sort of major strands of technology in order to try to have a kind of straightforward and simple communication. Since I last spoke with you, we've had a sizable increase in positive cases, and only in this last week we've had to send home 3 year groups while we're doing contact tracing. So it's really beginning to test the kind of systems that we've had in place. Back in March, we were very concerned that we wanted to put in place something that was going to be effective and take into account the sort of home circumstances in which our plans landed. And so we didn't opt for a sort of business as usual normal timetable. We didn't opt for a video streaming arrangement like many other schools, because we were concerned that on the basis of our evidence, we had teachers at home who were trying to manage their own circumstances with small children and the learning for those children in their own classes, as well as trying to sort of teach our children. We were very mindful of that. But our evidence was also telling us that on the surface, it seemed as though students were quite well stocked with different devices. And in fact, when we started to scratch away at that, we found that definitely was not the case, that there were many circumstances where the device that they had was not adequate for learning, and that very often that they were sharing devices with other siblings and parents and step parents across houses and so on. So it was much more complicated than we kind of first assumed. And given that the first lockdown arrived without any kind of warning, we didn't actually have a plan. And we kind of said to our staff, communicate in the best way that you can. It's really important that we keep the channels of communication going. But make sure that there is communication there. Don't just assume that if you send something off on one of the digital platforms that it's going to arrive. And so we kind of got over that initial hiatus, and people were relatively satisfied with what was going on until we discovered that the level of sort of marking and assessment of progress and assessment of engagement was beginning to reveal quite sort of sizable gaps, and that parents were saying to us, I'm sure that teachers are setting the work. I can see that that's happening on Frog, but there isn't any assessment going on. We are not being informed about progress, and my daughter is becoming demotivated as a consequence. So this was the sort of getting towards kind of June time, and we then started to do a fairly kind of detailed analysis of what means were students using to understand feedback, and what means were teachers using. And we came to the conclusion, in fact, that there were 14 separate technologies that teachers were using in order to communicate with students.
Wow.
Which is quite substantial. And some of it was fairly old school in terms of phoning. But you can imagine the way in which this was arriving in homes where children were sharing devices. There was a sort of expectation from us, implicitly so, that they could access these technologies. So Frog was definitely our biggest means of communicating marking, but we were emailing, we were using Office documents. There were a whole range of sort of different ways that kind of suited individual subjects. So we kind of came to the conclusion at the end of the summer term that this was not doing anybody any favors at all, and that we would then try to focus during the final 2 weeks on Frog and Frog alone. I'm not sure entirely how successful that was, but it made us come back in September with a clear picture of pretty much what we needed to do. Given the fact that we almost certainly knew that schools were coming back full time by then, and that the virus wasn't going away. So, you know, we kind of envisaged the scenario that's happening now, where you've got, you know, classes that don't have at times very many students in them. So our plan was really to embrace two technologies, one of which was a video streaming lesson technology, which we have taken on board, and the other one was to use Frog Markbook and Frog Feedback as the sole means of setting student work and assessing student work. And we had two teacher training days, in service days, at the beginning of the term. So we devoted those 2 days for staff training only on both of those technologies. And we then subsequently had live training days where we've used the technologies for every lesson of every day to really teach the students to be able to use them and understand and appreciate that that was the only place in which they were going to submit work for marking, view the feedback that was given on the marking, and then be able to respond to it wherever necessary. And that seems to have landed very well indeed. It means that we can keep everything really tight and everything is known. So we've got our analytics that are telling us the level of engagement. We've got our staff voice that's giving us some feedback around how it's working out through Frog. But because Frog Feedback is such a beautifully simple and really effective tool, it's got everything in it that colleagues would want. It's been incredibly favorably received. It means that we don't have to touch any paper unnecessarily within the classroom, you know, and once we have trained the students to get over the difficulty of taking photographs of work and uploading that through Frog apps, then it's all worked quite well.
I think, Andy, there's a couple of things in there that you've mentioned. So number one that I've taken out of there is that you said you had 14 different methods of feedback. Yeah. Number two, it sounds very much like this change of course of action was really driven by parents getting confused about what kind of feedback.
Very much so. Yeah.
And thirdly is a standardized approach. And really, how did you gauge what level of technical knowledge parents, students, teachers would be able to cope with?
I think we came to the conclusion that we really had to kind of start from scratch in trying to build this up. I think that any assumptions that we made around the level of engagement, and not just engagement, but the level of sort of cognitive processing and gaps in understanding, was much lower than we thought, particularly amongst the Key Stage 3 students. I imagine, I mean, the evidence is with the current year 11, probably about 50% of whom came back in during the summer term. Their understanding of the technologies has made the level of assessment feedback and general kind of management of the current situation much easier, and their parents as well. And we work quite hard to make them aware of the notifications processes in Frog that they could use in order to get a handle on all of that. The year 7 going into 8s into 9s has proven a little bit more of a process where we really have gone back back to basics and made no assumptions and had to start from the bottom upwards. And so that's kind of involved us having a couple of webinars for parents on how to use Frog. It's involved us creating digital video, which we have put onto our streaming site for parents on exactly where they can find the information that teachers are giving on the work that students are submitting.
Okay, so you're talking there about dealing with isolated students and giving parents a clear path of how do I find out how is my child doing, which is a big question, and I know that that's the question that a lot of people here will be thinking, how do I tell parents and answer their question, how is my child doing? And secondly, where do I find out that information and how do I interpret it? So how do you communicate to parents how to find this?
I think this goes back to our assessed curriculum, and we were sort of early advocates, I believe, of Frog Progress, and we found that during lockdown that the pattern of submitting work and assessing work was so patchy that we couldn't, with our hands on our hearts, judge that any progress was being made against KPIs. We felt that that was a really dangerous thing to do, given that lots of students were really struggling to get access to broadband, to devices, internet technology. We didn't want to sort of exacerbate the kind of social divides that were out there. But since September, we have become quite clear around reinforcing our assessed curriculum. So we have got our KPIs now that have been in place for 5 years. Over the last term, it was my job to stack them through full of exemplar standards and full of learning locker resources and extension resources. And so this has been it's a kind of system there that is fully supportive of remote learning. Now, in terms of how parents know about progress, we've always been very clear that we will report that the My Learning app, which is been enhanced over the summer term as part of the Earhart release, I think. That's actually looking really, really good. Because parents can see a quick summary of the judgments that teachers are making as they're landing. So with Frog Progress, we require them to make 2 judgments by December, and the judgments are simply, I think I've said many times at conferences, that they are simply the student has provided sufficient evidence to show that they understand the work, and so we would judge it achieved. Or if they haven't, then we would judge not achieved yet, and on the odd occasion where they are demonstrating a higher level of thinking, deeper level of understanding, we would judge that as exceeded. So that's available to parents and students all the time. And I think one of the benefits of keeping everything in Frog is that it's the natural and first place that parents go to find out that kind of information. So we've put out videos and communications that are saying the teachers are assessing. Some of you may well find that there is some information in some subjects at this stage, but you will, by the time we reach the end of December, you'll have 2 KPI judgments in all subjects right across the piece. Yeah. And then after that, we follow that with our KPI boost phase, which is a sort of dedicated catch-up phase. That's the plan anyway. Hopefully we can still do that with the numbers that we've got, but that is our plan.
So I think that's really important now. Obviously, many people with multiple solutions out there, and that could be something that they're using to assess against the curriculum, something they're using for setting homework, something they're using to communicate with parents. But what you're saying, you put everything together under one roof. Now, one other question I have for you in that instance, therefore, when you are delivering this blended learning approach and you are delivering your lessons to the children at home, how do you therefore identify those isolated students or those vulnerable, particularly vulnerable students, that may or may not be engaging with the work. What do you do? And could you talk us through that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, we've been charged by our local authority to have a COVID recovery strategy plan for students who haven't engaged and have got gaps in their learning. So we were fairly clear about the levels of engagement, first of all, and we used Frog Analytics as a major part of that. We could see quite clearly students who had not submitted work through Frog where they were required to, or through those students who hadn't even looked through assignments. So the level of engagement was quite useful as a first sort of point of defining who the group was. We then started to do once they returned to school, we then started to do some baseline assessment in large subjects and smaller type assessment in those subjects that, I mean core subjects where students are, where everybody receives a core subject. But in the smaller curriculum subjects, we did a series of tests and so on to try to identify where the gaps were. It's been really hard. Because there have been some really interesting things that have confounded this. So when we started to look at gap and engagement against reading scores, we found that the students who had sort of high levels of disengagement very often had higher reading scores than they had when they were with us in September last year. And we don't really know why this is, but we suspect it's because they have been at home talking to their parents much more, and who have been talking about schoolwork and things like this. They've had a higher level of conversation, and there is a link between the quality of the conversation and the reading score. So trying to unpick it has been particularly difficult. It's not an axiomatic process where no engagement, therefore don't know. When a student is attested for gaps and they're not showing evidence, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't know. But with our plan, the point at which we've got to at the moment is to create a list of target individuals, and we are planning on offering a tutored support that is a wraparound tutored support. So we are looking at the students and their families and really trying to not just deliver kind of chunks of content in subjects, but to try to get to what it is that enables the students to access the learning and understanding, that kind of level of individual and personalized support that can be offered through our school-based program to start with. And that's where we're going to go, and we're looking particularly at year 8 and 9, and we've got a lot of data on year 7s coming through, a lot of data that we would take anyway at the beginning of the year. So that's our kind of focus for gaps and catch up. In terms of the technologies on gaps and catch up, that's really important, because very often some of these students simply don't know how to access homework on Frog. They don't know how to look at the My Learning on Frog. They don't know how to look at the kind of assignments lists and calendar and how to plan it through. And it's the planning of the support with those sorts of things. This is what you've got, and this is where you could do it, and this is how I help you interpret the resources. Those sorts of things. That's how we're going to go forward with it.
Andy, thank you so much. There's one last thing that I'd really like to hear from you before you go. Now, this is something that's really interesting. We've talked about parental engagement and keeping it simple and the whole school approach, etc., and one standardised approach. But one thing you talked to me about a couple of weeks ago was, how do you basically transition from the incoming students that, for example, they've not used your platform? So your platform could be any platform, and we're not saying this is Frog specific, but you have new students joining your schools, and they can't necessarily come for an open day. They can't necessarily walk around. Yeah. Yes, they could go online and get a little bit of a video walkthrough of what the school's like, but actually, how do you prepare them for coming in the new year 7 when actually their bubble might suddenly go off again? And I know you've done something on this.
Yeah, well, we imagined a horrendous scenario with our year 7s coming through to us, having been out of education largely for about 3 months and trying to get their heads around the digital technologies that we were going to throw at them from the off, to be, to expect them to become experts at managing, all the stuff that Frog has got in it. And so what I thought I would do was to try to get to a position really where they were quite familiar with it at the end of the summer term and also over the summer holidays. So I constructed a Frog site that largely had homework as the only app on it, and the rest of it was just a series of Frog games that I borrowed from Frog Play around a good number of sort of foundation key stage 2 subjects, and a few other bits and pieces that I brought in from elsewhere. But the aim was that we wanted the students, we set up the Frog accounts beforehand. We've still stuck with their login details. And the aim really was to try to ensure that they had logged in. Oh, hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
I'm back.
You're back, brilliant. They'd actually logged in and had a go at the games and so on, and had a look at homework. And we made that available to both the students and the parents. Obviously, the students we couldn't give the parents' accounts out just yet, and that made a real difference. Once again, Frog Analytics was telling me that nearly all of them had logged in and had a go, and we had some nice little competitions being generated. But the truth of it is, it meant that when they arrived, we weren't going through that process of having to show them Frog, having to get them set up, having to deal with all the password kind of issues, all of those sort of things that are going to make it more difficult, given that we didn't know which students were coming in and what we might have to do if students tested positive and so on. So it was something that I would definitely do again.
That's just fantastic. And are there any takeaways or any hints and tips that you just want to share with anybody here? Any of those challenges you had along the way?
Keep it simple. First of all, make sure that you're quite clear that all of your staff are doing this in one way and one way only, and that they're not doing other things as well. That's a really big, getting the buy-in from staff and spending the time right at the outset to say, this is the way that we're going to do this, and building up a sort of rational argument for doing so is really important. You also get some things that you learn during the course of the process, and one of the things that I learned the other day, which I think was significant, and I'm not sure where it's going to go, was that our geography team were creating assignments in Markbook and then asking the students to upload it. They applied some success criteria to the assignment, and they then were marking against the success criteria. And of course, they realized that these made fantastic exemplars for the KPIs. So they could take screenshots of this and then push it into the exemplars, which then became a really strong, invaluable teaching resource for the rest of the cohort and for parents and students, to do remotely. So that was a bit of a find, and at the moment I think only geography are doing it, but I'm sure at some point when we all recover from panicking about positive test cases, we're gonna start pushing that out, because that seems like a really, really good thing.
That sounds fantastic. Hopefully you'll come and tell us a little bit more about that in the future.